Good evening. Welcome to the October 28th joint study session with the Stillwater City Council and the Stillwater Planning Commission. At this time, I will call the meeting to order for the City Council and the Planning Commission in this joint study session. Tonight, we have one item on our agenda, one general order. This is a joint study session of the Stillwater City Council and the Planning Commission to discuss and consider short-term rentals in the city of Stillwater, including but not limited to possible discussion and presentation of statistics of residential short-term rentals within the city, including the number of licenses issued, code enforcement complaints and activity, tax collections attributable to short-term rentals, possible discussion of the city's short-term rental code provisions, which may include comparisons to similar code provisions from other Oklahoma cities, and possible direction to staff regarding short-term rentals in the city of Stillwater. There will be no action taken on this item. This is a study session. We will not be taking action on this item. This is a chance for the City Council and the Planning Commission to speak together about issues and that have come up with our short-term rentals. And so looking forward to this discussion, and I will turn it over to Interim City Manager Brady Moore to take us from here.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. My name is Brady Moore, and I just want to again thank you all for being here this evening. This is a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the City Council, which is great. So we're grateful for your all's attendance, and we're excited to hear your experiences through this process. We're going to discuss short-term rentals, which kind of is at best is a complicated topic for municipalities. Short-term rentals can have a positive impact on the visitor economy of a town and gown community like we have here in Stillwater. Stillwater is a host city, and so it can be a positive impact when we host events here in Stillwater. However, short-term rentals do have their diverse challenges as well, such as demand on affordable housing inventory, demands on our infrastructure, such as trash, reduced parking, wear to neighborhoods and roads, and just the overall impact that can have on efforts to protect the character and safety of our neighborhoods. So it is a complicated topic, but we're excited to talk about it tonight. We're going to discuss the current process in the city code that we have here in Stillwater that regulates our short-term rentals. We want to hear from the Planning Commission, as mentioned, in their experience in reviewing and deciding on short-term rental applications. And we want to hear from the public about their experiences with short-term rentals in their community. And I'd like to quickly introduce to my left here is Senior Assistant Attorney Kim Payne. She works closely with the Planning Commission at their meetings, and she also works closely with our planning department. And Kim has done a considerable amount of research and preparation for tonight's meeting. And but now I'll turn it over to Jacqueline Porter, our city planner. She's going to quickly walk us through some short-term rental data, current code and process that we have for STR applications, and how our code compares to other cities. And then after this, we'll open up the floor to the Planning Commission. So go ahead, Jackie.
Before Jackie jumps in, just want to remind folks, if you do want to speak, if you do want to make comments tonight at the meeting, there's a form that we'd like to have you fill out. It should be right up there in the front. Please fill out one of those forms and hand it to probably Dawn Dotson back there, and she can make sure you get signed up for the meeting.
Yeah, and Dawn also asked that we all speak into the mic. So if it is your turn to speak or you'd like to speak, go ahead and grab the mic. It might even better to hold it like I am rather than the little holder. So, but yes, please use the mic so we can pick it up on the recording. Thank you.
All right. Good evening. Thank you, Mayor, council members, and Planning Commission for being here tonight to discuss short-term rentals. My name's Jacqueline Porter, city planner. I will be going over the Stillwater's requirements and process, as well as what other communities do for short-term rentals. Stillwater's definition for a short-term rental is defined as any dwelling, portion thereof, or habitable accessory structure for rent for a temporary period of a time up to 30 consecutive days per guest within a 90-day period. This here is a map of Stillwater with all its short-term rentals. There are currently 180 issued and 145 that are active, and that is in the pink. And then the green is the non-active. Non-active is those that didn't pull their application before they got issued a license, or they didn't renew within the time. All this is from 2019 to now. There's currently 7 in review, and 3 of those are currently on their objection period, and then will be presented to Planning Commission here in the future. All right. So since 2019, short-term rentals were allowed in Stillwater. Only 3 locations have had complaints to code enforcement. The complaints consist of parking, blue trash carts, the Westwood Overlake occupancy in a party. Only 1 location, the complaint was founded, and that was with 2 parking complaints, the 3 blue carts complaints, and 1 party. A lot of peeves. All right. At this time, I'm going to turn this over to Christine to discuss taxes.
So short-term rentals do have a positive economic impact on Stillwater. The owners and operators are required to collect and remit both sales tax and visitor tax. So our most recent estimates on that economic impact is about a $500,000 annual increase in revenue.
All right. So, where are short-term rentals allowed? They're allowed in the small lot, single-family residential, large lot, single-family residential, and 2-family residential zoning districts. They are used by right in the high-density residential areas in commercial zoning districts. So, here's a licensing process from a staff standpoint. An application is submitted to the city clerk. Staff examines the current zoning for its applicability in the zoning districts of RSS, RSL, and RT. Staff drafts and mails the required notices to the property owners within 300 feet of the short-term rental. If an objection is received, a short-term rental license is issued. So there is an objection period, and that objection period is 30 days from once it was applied to then after. And so if an objection is received, a public hearing will be scheduled for Planning Commission, and a second notice will be sent out to the property owners within 300 feet. If Planning Commission approves the short-term rental, they have 3 options, or Planning Commission has 3 options to approve or deny or table it. If it is approved and there's no issues, it's issued. Now, there is a 10-day appeal period right after Planning Commission's decision. With this, the appeals and objections can be received by anybody in the city. It exceeds those within the 300 feet. So if we receive an appeal, of Planning Commission's decision, the City Council is the hearing body for all appeals. We receive, hold on. Oops.
Jackie, if I may, just
Yeah.
as a point of clarification, I think you just misspoke on the process regarding the objections. But after an application is received, if there is not an objection received during the objection period, then the license is issued without a hearing in front of the Planning Commission. However,
Correct.
if there's an objection received, then it proceeds to the Planning Commission for a hearing on the matter. If Planning Commission issues the license and then there's an appeal received, that appeal goes to a hearing before the City Council. Just wanted to clarify that because there are a lot of steps in the process. And
with the appeal, staff sends out a 3rd notice as well. All right, so licensing fees. It's a $100 initial application fee. This does not meet the postage cost or the processing time that staff's put in to this. There is an annual renewal fee of $10. It does not require a notice or any action by Planning Commission. It is reviewed at the annual renewal in January if there has been any complaints and such, if they are allowed to renew. So, on to the good stuff. Short-term rentals considered in other communities, we broke it down into 3 categories. There are broad regulations, defined regulations, and then none at all. So cities without any regulations are short-term rentals are Edmond, Enid, and Owasso. For your broad regulations, there were various approaches. During research, staff looked into a city with similar characteristics to Stillwater, with the majority of the cities that we did research were in Oklahoma. Ames, Iowa is the home of Iowa State and is comparable in population. Ames requires a short-term rental to be on the same property with the same structure as the primary resident. The short-term rental is considered an accessory use to the property. Ames requires a letter of compliance with each application and inspection with an annual renewal. Jinx, Oklahoma requires a conditional permit in all zoning districts reviewed and approved by planning staff. They do require a life safety inspection. The intent of their code was to have an annual renewal, but like most cities, staffing has been limited in the ability to enforce and track. And then we have more in Bixby. Oklahoma code requires a specific use permit for those. All right, for the cities that have more defined regulations, we have Broken Arrow. Their short-term rentals has an entire section dedicated to the regulations, enforcement, and grounds for denial. The required license inspections with an annual review, which requires a screening with the request of from the rest of the neighborhood. And then Norman is a short-term rentals addressed in the ordinance, direct guidelines on grounds for denial, requirements that address common neighborhood concerns through enforcement, noise, traffic, etc. And there is an annual inspection that is required. Courtesy notices are sent by the applicant when a new short-term rental is applied for, but no public hearings at Planning Commission or City Council. So on to the last one. Tulsa, short-term rentals are considered a use by right in all zoning classes, but is required to license to operate. At this time, I'm going to allow Planning Commission to provide their voice on their observations and challenges with the short-term rental process. Jana.
I'm just gonna wait and see. Yes. We'll do that. Yes. I was going to defer to, can you hear that? Okay. I was going to defer to my planning commissioners, if the planning commissioners, and see if anybody had anything they specifically wanted to address, or if you'd like me to just kind of talk about the things that we usually hear. They can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Oh, I have to like put it all the way up and like eat it like an ice cream cone. Okay. So I was going to say, I would ask if any of the other planning commissioners would like to jump in at first, or if you'd like me just to kind of start generally on the things we typically hear. All right, I'm getting a thumbs up. So some of the things we typically hear are the things that you've seen. How's trash going to be handled? Parking issues, parties, those sorts of things, things that go into place that might keep from having a party in a place. So no in-town reservations. If the person making the reservation is in town, it's denied. Those are certain things that people ask for. Minimum 2-night stay, so it's not a 1-night stay. Hopefully, to maybe not have a party in a place. Some of the other things that we often hear are safety of children in the neighborhood. If there's a sex offender that would want to get close to a school, that would be something that is of concern to some of the neighbors. Some of the other things are just the increased amount of traffic into a neighborhood. That's another one that we hear frequently. I think one of the ones that was already on the PowerPoint is the Westwood Overlay District, how many non-related people can be in a residence. Some of the others that often come before us would be concerns in and of a homeowners association. And as a planning commission, we cannot enforce any of that. The city cannot enforce that, but we can take it into consideration. I think the other thing that kind of comes up, and it's really hard to define, is does the short-term rental change the character of the neighborhood? There are some areas of town where these are more concentrated. I think we saw that on the map earlier. And does the concentration change a neighborhood? And so I think those are most of the things that we often hear. Any other things any other commissioners would like to add? Anything I missed? I'm looking at Commissioner Shanahan. I know one of the things that we that comes up too and was mentioned early on is impact of affordable housing. What this might have for residents. Anything else?
Is this on? I guess it is. Yeah, I would concur with the chair. Affordable housing impact, I think, is hard to define in terms of data collection. I do know that in a recent National League of Cities national meeting in Nashville, that this subject of short-term rentals was the most highlighted subject, both in work study sections and in discussion groups. And one of those items they discussed was the impact of affordable housing. We already have issues with that just because we're a college town, correct? And you take houses off the market, so could be investment property owners. It could be just single family owners sometimes. But that is a real challenge in this town. I don't know that anyone has a real answer to that yet. Also, I think that I think Jim kind of emphasized this, a real problem we have on the Planning Commission is we have no guidelines. All right, our guidelines aren't official. Essentially, it's the feedback we get from the community, what they see. Also, talking about the character of the neighborhood, this again is rather ambiguous, but I do know there have been several protests in the neighborhood off of Washington Street, north of the campus. A real concern that this was once pretty much a dominant single family neighborhood with a lot of children, and that's been impacted the past 10 years or so, and it has caused kind of a deterioration in the character of the neighborhood. So those are some of the issues I think we see. But the biggest is we need to have some set of policy guidelines to help direct us.
I'll add to that. Commissioner Shanahan and I are kind of telling you all the negatives about it. I always like to have a positive as well with the negatives. So I do think that the short-term rentals provide a service that can't be provided elsewhere in the city. So I think it's important to find a healthy way to guide how this is handled, because I think it does serve a purpose for our community. Our size is special, I think, and being the town and gown relationship, as was mentioned earlier, there are just some unique aspects to a town the size of Stillwater. The number of visitors that we have over the course of the year centered around major events, it really creates some interesting bumps in the road.
Does City Council have any comments?
I think I'd actually like to move public comment to this point. It's the microphone expert next to me. I think it'd be great to hear from the public, comments that folks have. I've got several folks signed up to provide comments at this point, unless anybody on council really has something they want to say at this point. Let's hear from the public. I'd love to hear what other folks in the community have to say about the current situation. Actually, maybe before we do that, I do have a couple of questions just on staff's presentation, just maybe some clarifications or some questions about what's been presented so far, just to maybe get some of those issues fleshed out a little bit. One, maybe I guess we should start with like the underlying reason why we have a short-term rental regulation in the first place. And we did put this in place in 2019, I think, if I recall right. Most of us, some of us at least, were on council at the time. We had that conversation. I think, this came up because of the concern about the fact that the zones where we require these licenses are zones where commercial activity is generally prohibited, right? And the idea of a short-term rental being operated in a single-family neighborhood was considered commercial activity, and you couldn't really do that without a permit. Can you expound any more just on sort of the reason we're doing that, and if we're doing it because we don't want to allow commercial activity in single-family neighborhoods, how are some of the other communities that you mentioned don't have any regulation at all about this? Are they just ignoring it? Have they completely canceled? Said nobody can do this at all? I mean, how? There's that whole conflict that started this conversation 5 years ago.
Okay, so again, this is also before my time, but my understanding is the short-term rentals kind of was supposed to proceed within those the lower residential density areas, like a specific use permit. So the neighbors would know what's going on, what's in their backyard, and just let them know. And if they didn't feel comfortable with it, they were allowed that time to object and then go through our little process. Now, other cities, it varies. There are some that don't allow it at all. There are some that just say, go for it. And they have no regulations whatsoever. And that's throughout the whole entire state. Diana Hood, she did my associate city planner did all the research. So she, yep, they're under. But they were so wide and variety of how they handle it. So there's not really, the ones that I presented were ones that were kind of closer in size for us, but even smaller communities don't regulate them at all. So that's all I've got on that.
Mayor, if I may add just a little bit of commentary to that. There were pretty much two guiding principles in regulating short-term rentals. First is that they are not regulated on a state level. So they've left it up to local governments to decide how to regulate them that best meets the needs of each community. The regulations, as I recall, the history of our current code provisions was to address residential zoning districts, and that would be the zoning in which we would require a license. And we did follow, as Jackie said, very much that specific use permit as far as the review of the license. Another primary concern, though, was the local lodging industry, because you have hotels that were already invested in the city and paying lodging taxes. And so regulation also ensures that we're able to capture that economic benefit to the city. And so that's a little bit of the background for our current code provision.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So you mentioned in commercial districts or in high density housing, there is no license required because there's not that same, they're by right, use by right. So they don't have to, if you wanted to open one of these downtown in a commercial district, you don't have to apply for any license from the city.
Correct.
But by law, you're still supposed to register to pay lodging tax and sales tax on those.
Correct. You still have to apply with the state, and through Airbnb requires you, and Verbo requires you to do all those applications and provide those.
So in the numbers, I think you said we have about 140 licenses right now, but are those tax numbers that you showed just those 140, or is it anybody that's registered, even if they may not actually be a licensed facility here in the city?
So coming up with that estimate was a little bit of a challenge, because some are operated by the owner and some are not. Some do contract with Airbnb or VRBO. We all know that VRBO, you can reserve a regular hotel room through that. So it was a little bit of a challenge to come up with a good number. So that is a good estimate.
Of all the activity,
all the
not
activity.
necessarily just the license, the 140 that we have licensed in residential neighborhoods.
Yeah, and there's no way to know how many are remitting through VRBO or Airbnb without asking them to disclose that.
Yeah, and to answer your question, yes, the numbers were rough estimates based off what comes in from the taxing commission,
Yeah.
correct, in that category for visitor tax and Airbnb and VRBO type collections. And those platforms have made it easy where, like, I think Kimberly mentioned that yeah, they collect and remit the sales tax for those users on those platforms. So to answer your question, that total number revenue would capture more than what you're seeing on the map, because there's those that are operating in a commercial area.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, that's my other question is going to be then how do we enforce permit requirements, right? How many, do we know that there aren't? Well, I mean, I would assume there's a certain number of these that are operating in areas where we would require a license that haven't gotten an actual license, that haven't done what they're supposed to do and gone out and get that license. Do we know what that number might be? Do we have any estimate of? I mean, I think I heard maybe from Christy at some point that we're talking about 500 plus that are actually listed on sites in the Stillwater area. Those other 400 of them aren't just in commercial areas, I would assume.
Correct. We currently don't have a process in trying to obtain all those. Code enforcement does go through and try to capture those that haven't pulled a license. But we do that probably quarterly, just to go through. But those in the commercial and such, we don't keep track of those when they do that research.
If I may add to that, code enforcement also receives complaints, maybe from a possible neighbor saying, hey, I think there's a short-term rental operating on this house. Is there a license? Code enforcement checks into that, and then they will do some investigation to determine whether or not they are operating a short-term rental and whether they have a license. If they don't have a license, they believe they are operating one, they will reach out to them and make contact and get them into compliance.
I'll add to during the research on some of the communities that Diana put together for us, there are communities that are subscribing to softwares, the packages that are pretty expensive, kind of like the Placer AI type, but it does go into that data that's somewhat hidden in Airbnb and VRBO and can give you some of those addresses and the numbers that are operating when a city doesn't, like we do, don't license in commercial areas or high density areas.
Okay. Well, that's the questions I had about the presentation. Any other just sort of factual questions that we want to ask before we have public comment?
Well, I'll just mention that I am a little concerned that we don't know where any of these commercial locations are. Because if somebody's on the second floor downtown and there's a fire in a building and fire doesn't know there could be people on the second floor of that building because they think so it's vacant overnight, they won't be doing any rescue efforts, right? I think there's some life safety concerns about, even if they don't have to go through a licensing process, at least registering that location so we know that there potentially could be people there.
All right. Let's hear from the public. Love to hear what you all have to say about this. And I'm going to take these, well, I guess in whatever order I'm sitting in right now. First up, I have Gary Clark. If you could just introduce yourself with your name and address, and then I think we're going to give 3 minutes. If you want to go longer than 3 minutes, maybe don't.
I'm Gary Clark. I live at 320 Idler Lane. Can you hear me okay? Yes, sir. Okay, well, first of all, while I'm starting, if you might throw up on the map all the locations, I'd appreciate that. I have a couple of questions. Have you denied any short-term rentals?
Yes.
How many?
I believe Steph has that answer.
Okay, we've had one denial and then 2 that were appealed.
Yeah, that they were ultimately approved, or, you know?
Well, other than the one that denied it died, and then the 2 that were appealed to city council were approved.
Well, I'm only familiar with one instance, and that was on Isler Lane. And that was approved by the Planning Commission unanimously, approved by the City Council unanimously, and in my opinion, completely overlooked the impact on the neighborhood. And if you're going to just ignore those things, then I'm not sure what we have to talk about. Frankly, I'm very disappointed in the approach that was taken in those cases. And I think, at least I think there are some additional things I know you have shown, and to me, you have the potential of a neighborhood killer. A number of us have worked very hard to make the Westwood Neighborhood Association area and the district overlay to be a nicer neighborhood, and we've made tremendous progress. And then you throw in a house that, at least this particular house, I would say over the last, they now have a 1 year rental, or at least a semester rental, because it was never rented. It was basically an abandoned house in our neighborhood and on our little street. With only 5 or 6 houses, you take away about 25% of the neighborhood. That's a killer, and we can't have it. If you put in another one, you get a couple or 3, then I want to move out. I don't want to be there. And so as a city council, a city planning commission, I think you have a responsibility to try to enforce the ordinance as it was written. I mean, it very clearly grants you the right. And apparently you seem to think that you didn't have any choice, or at least that's the way it came across that night, both of those 2 nights. And in fact, anytime a legislative body is attacked on equal protection grounds, all they have to show is a reasonable basis for their decision. Every neighbor around there said, we oppose this because this will have a negative impact on our neighborhood, and talked about specific reasons. There was ample support for denial of that, but it was approved unanimously in each case. And I find that personally unacceptable, extremely unacceptable. And so, I would point out, I saw the numbers that were proposed of the positive environmental impact. I can't believe that's a net number. What do you miss out if you don't have anybody living in that house at all for 6 months, let's say? That might be. What have you lost in terms of tax revenues, economic activity in the neighborhood?
You were part of that was staff talking, Gary. So if you have more to say, I'm happy to have you. Thank you for your comments. Next up, I have Bob Grallman.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be around you folks, many of whom I've worked with over the years. I've lived, and my wife, Diane, who's co-president of the Westwood Neighborhood Association, we've lived in our home for 43 years in the Westwood neighborhood. So if you want any commentary on the ups and downs and the vagaries of neighborhood life, we're your people, because we know, we've seen it. And I think Gary's comments were very well advised on the subtle but devastating impact that can occur over the years if we don't pay attention to the rules that we set in place. People ask me, about our neighborhood association and why we didn't make some statement about VRBOs and other short-term rentals when we established our organization some 17, 18 years ago. I'm not exactly sure when that is. And I think that everybody here can answer that. Who'd ever heard of such a thing as VRBOs and Airbnbs? But now they're here and they are changing things quite dramatically. We had last week a guest speaker at our Westwood Neighborhood Association, Councilor Hawkins, who did a very good job. And we had at that meeting probably the largest turnout that we've ever had in our 15-year or so history. What we can have concluded after all the presentations and the things that we heard, and by the way, she did a fantastic job of talking to us about the various taxes that are on tap for this year. So her appearing at our neighborhood association was very important for the city, and we really appreciate her doing that. Nevertheless, we still have residency and enforcement problems with occupancy and with parking and maintenance in our neighborhood. Fortunately, I'm happy to say, as I told Christy, I tell people to pass along congratulations to the people who are doing lawn and yard maintenance and who are also working on the wrong side of the street parking and yard parking, because that is crucial to the health of our neighborhood as well. The one thing that we just continue to have problems with is over occupancy. And we know how difficult this is. You can't just walk into an apartment and start counting heads and say, you all can't be here. We believe that our original ordinance was passed so that the fine for over occupancy is $750 per day per violation. We have heard now that people are being disciplined by being told, well, just give us the $750 donation now or fine, and then we'll call it good. So I think I've said pretty much what I want to say. We do appreciate your attention to these matters, and we will keep working. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I guarantee you that I could say how many of you drive now down University along 3rd Street back into that neighborhood and say, you know what? Those folks are doing a pretty good job, and they need to be paid attention to. It wasn't always so. Before we started the neighborhood association, I looked out my window down to the creek along Ridge Road, and there was a brawl going on with about 30 or 40 people. Later, about half a year later, I decided that I had to give up my nightly walks after dark, which I really love. Well, I'm happy to say I haven't seen that. I think the neighborhood association is a big reason for that. And as Gary Clark said, we now believe that the short-term rentals need similar attention for a part of the city that I'm sure all of you are very proud of when you go through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Denise Talley.
Am I the last one?
I'm sorry?
Am I the last
No. There's a few more.
Take me for the last.
I already have one request to be saved for last, so you're going to be second to last. Mark Weiser.
I actually had not planned on talking at all, but I was handed a form, so there you go. My wife and I choose to enjoy the ownership of our property partially through renting, either long-term or short-term, which of course is our right under various legal decisions. And this is one way that we rent properties. My concern is actually more about enforcement. I'm a university professor in business, and I do some things with short-term rentals, or I have in the past. And we actually went looking for non-licensed entities here and elsewhere. And now this goes back a couple of years, so this is not a current snapshot, but it was about 50-50. And it was actually done by Google Street View, so literally with the pictures of the houses finding the property, so we knew we were about right. And with the, not all that recent anymore, but the 75% increase in lodging taxes that occurred a few years back, I was hoping some of that would be used for enforcement. But I don't believe it is. I'm not sure about that because there is a large number. And then with that big concert that was announced, most of the homes on there that we went and looked were not licensed. So, now the problem is our enforcement policy is if you're caught, we give you 30 days to get licensed, right? So odds are good they won't get caught. If they are caught, well, the concert's over, right? So we're going to have probably an extra 300 short-term rentals that weekend, and that weekend's going to be crazy enough. So anyway, that my issue is more about those people who are trying to live within we have things collected wherever possible through Airbnb, and we also have a tax permit. So if something is not done through Airbnb, it's done through us. So we try to follow the policies. We try to be good neighbors. We drive by our houses multiple times every week, whenever possible, more frequently than that. But we do wish there was a way to inspire others to do the same. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Denise Talley, you're second to last.
Well, I had no plans on talking. I just wanted to come and hear what this was all about. But there's several things I think after hearing the concerns that I'd like to share. We started our Airbnbs back, I think in 2017, 18. I met with the city. There were some other folks that were a part, and we discussed taxes and just certifications and things like that at that time. I understand the concerns of the neighborhoods. I so appreciate that. For those of you that don't know, I'm a real estate agent. So I deal with people all the time, and buying your home is a very, very important. It's going to be over 3 minutes. But buying a home is a very important decision, and everybody wants to keep their property and keep the integrity, right? Hence why the Westwood overlay came in, right? So I do know that subdivisions that have HOAs, they can update those, they can amend those HOAs. There have been several that have done so to say no renting, etc. Right? So that's an option for that. We have really enjoyed the Airbnbs because it's been a blessing to our family. We do have people that mow regularly. We do know how to monitor. It's a special trick when you get into this world of knowing how to monitor those people, to know how many people are there. We do that. We have figured out the trick. We have Ring doorbells. We put them on the door so you can see how many people. We have certain questions that we ask when people arrive. We confirm how many people are staying, and we drive by our properties and make sure. If you were to look at any one of our properties, they are probably some of the best in the neighborhood because we take pride in what we have, and we've taught our children that, and this is our future for our children. It was an opportunity for us to supplement our income, and it has been a huge blessing. So I feel like when I was listening that I hear the aches and pains, but I also hear there's a lack of guidance and criteria how this should look. And also, I know that it's very hard to come in and monitor that. But for those things, there has to be some like what the gentleman, Mr. Wise, is that correct? Weiser, what he said about if there are houses and neighborhoods that are not taking care of their yards, that are not following the rules, they need to be, addressed immediately. And if they can't follow, then they don't need to be a part of the program. But I don't think it should punish other people who really have tried really hard to do what's right and to be able to help supplement income for their families. Now, again, I want our properties to add value to the neighborhood. And, that allows me to buy more. So, I really think there needs to be a guideline in this process over here that nips it in the bud immediately and has maybe a fine for that. But I also don't think it should punish the other people who are really working really hard and taking care of their properties. So,
Thank you so much. Christy, you're up last. Do you want to have anything to add?
Well, for those who don't know, I'm Christy Morrison with Visit Stillwater, and clearly the travel and tourism industry is my life and has been for, on Wednesday, 29 years. There is definitely a great opportunity with short-term rentals. We do a lot of research through Vrbo and Airbnb, and we do have a lot of data points. Mine say that there's between 501 and 579 short-term rentals in our area, not necessarily right in the city limits, but at least within close to our city limits and our city limits. However, a big part of my job is also promoting the image and brand of Stillwater as America's friendliest college town. And if we have any of those properties that are, like Gary said, not in a good state, or they don't represent our community well, then obviously we don't want them. They don't do us any good, right? Because people unfortunately, they'll say, well, that's all of Stillwater. Those poor properties will reflect our whole community, and so we don't need that. But between Mark and we have people in this room that have had a short-term rental since before most people even knew they existed. And so if we could get maybe a group together, I have a lot of data at my fingertips. We get it daily, monthly, weekly, that I think that might be able to help out a little bit. I do feel like we're really a progressive community. It's not just large events in Stillwater. There are certain traveling public now that will only stay in short-term rentals. They prefer them over hotels. So even on times that you might think that we're not in need of the rooms above and beyond the 1,404 hotel rooms we have, they still choose that. And from an economy standpoint, I love that because short-term rentals are generally a lot more expensive than a hotel room. So they're spending a lot more money and generating a lot more tax for our community. So, but we do need to find, obviously, the balance, because I also get every newsletter in the world directed toward the hospitality industry, and there are nightmares out there, and we don't want to become that nightmare community for sure.
Thank you. I don't have anyone else signed up to speak. Was there anyone else here who was planning to speak that didn't sign up? All right. Well, I have a couple of comments and questions, but I'm going to let the rest of the city council chat about this first.
There's a couple of things I would say about this, and I think it's like everything that we have to find the balance. It's not that particularly I'm opposed to Airbnbs or short-term rentals, but I do think we need to have some guardrails so that we are protecting our neighborhood. I know we are hospitality. I mean, America's friendliest town and campus and all that, but I think we also owe it to our community to take our community members into consideration and how these things might impact them. In looking at, while I appreciated kind of some of the cities we did a comparison to, I really think the more worthwhile comparison, other than just Ames, Iowa, are football towns, are college towns, because I think that's really where the comparison is. In doing a little reading, some of the things that I have seen that could be taken into consideration as we are looking at our ordinance and what we're going to do with it. Lawrence, Kansas is an example. Short-term rentals in single-family residential districts must be owner-occupied in Lawrence, Kansas. And the owner must live there for at least 9 months of the year. Now, that sounds great, but we also have to balance out with compliance and how easy that is for the city to monitor. And that, I think, is a tricky thing. Fayetteville, Arkansas, there's no cap on the number of owner-occupied rentals, but they have an overall cap on how many short-term rentals they can have in the town. Other communities have looked at percentages within districts. I think that's also sounds great, but becomes a little problematic to figure out what district is where and how you're dividing that up. Let's see, there's a couple others that have kind of jumped out at me. Some people will have like a limit of how many short-term rentals one person can own and run within a city, and so it can't be monopolized. And so there's just Columbia, Missouri is another example that has kind of 3 tiers of rental types, and that depends on if the property is used as a primary resident, the number of days a property can be rented out, and then the zoning district. And I do think for us, it's important that we maintain, especially for the single-family residents, the single-family zones, that we do have something where we can track and ensure people are filing and getting getting a license for a short-term rental. So again, I'm not opposed to short-term rentals, but I do think we need to work really hard to get some guardrails in place so that we are protecting the neighborhoods. And again, I think the idea of keeping affordable housing available, and that's not just the inventory, but when people come in and buy those properties with the intent for it to be a short-term rental, they are oftentimes paying a higher price, which in turn increases the value of the homes in that neighborhood and can make it less possible for people to afford those homes. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of things. I'm glad we're having this study session. I think there are a lot of things to look at, but I think we can find common ground that makes this a little more bearable for the people that want to own and operate these, but also the people that live in the neighborhoods.
I also, is that working? Yeah. I also think the town and gown aspect of this for our community is a really important layer. As I was reading and researching, I think the fact that we will likely, as we pull that map up that shows it's the neighborhoods around campus that are probably receiving the most pressure from short-term rental perspective and carrying a large part of that burden in our community. And I think opportunities for caps on the numbers in those neighborhoods or moratoriums or the types would be very important. I think also being a university town, a college town, that it would be very, I think overall data here is so very important. I really appreciate, Christy, your comment to say that you have data that you can share. I think from a staff perspective, I would like us to get more data so that we understand exactly, can get our arms around the issue a little bit better, so we understand the types of visitors we should be planning for in our community, and that we're making policy accordingly. I think that's so very important here. But I would wonder, just looking at the long-term rental market, how many are even in town. We had 2 speakers today that were in-town owners, which is amazing to know that you drive by your properties and are caring for those properties so well. But I know in recent times in front of council, we've had some that are not in-town owners of those properties, which likely changes the way that those properties are maintained. And so I think that kind of data would be very helpful. I'd love to hear some of the examples that you shared, Councilor Hawkins, of, looking at the data and providing ordinances and policy that reflects kind of the character of actual ownership and what those short-term rentals are. I think when short-term rentals first started, I can remember a colleague of mine was literally couch surfing, and I thought, how weird is that? It's so strange that, they would be staying in a stranger's home. I think it started that way, but clearly in Stillwater, that's not the case. I know my own family, recently we had a water line leak in our home, and we're looking for an Airbnb, unfortunately, during football season, and it was impossible to find an Airbnb. Every single one in town was booked. Only on game day, game day weekends we're out. We could get a place, but we'd have to move out for game day weekends. So clearly that's what they're being used for here. So I think that part's very important. I do want to speak also to the folks from the neighborhoods that are here. As a planner, I do think that this can be a stress and a burden to a neighborhood when you think about even just that scenario that I mentioned of having game day weekends booked, but the other 5 days of that week, a vacant property, just the integrity of that neighborhood and the fabric of those communities, that can be very stressful in a neighborhood. I do think we find that short-term rentals are often well kept. That's kind of the image that's necessary in order for them to be rented. I would argue perhaps that our longer-term rentals struggle more in Stillwater with property maintenance. But I think on that topic, it moves me to think more about enforcement and kind of what we're able to do. And I would encourage and like for staff to look at, it's challenging, the staff time associated with that, But I think, Jacqueline, you also mentioned that we're not covering the cost of even the application and postage when we are licensing. Can we look at increasing the fees there in order to help us with enforcement? Or is there opportunity in the additional lodging tax to perhaps help with that as well? I think that could be an opportunity as well. But, we do see in the data, when we look at other communities, and just from a planning perspective as a whole, this can be a stress on the neighborhood, the fabric of that community. It's a stress on infrastructure in terms of solid waste, in terms of the roads. And certainly we should be building in ways to protect that in our community.
This is a fundamentally difficult problem because of sort of the competing interests here, right? And we've got the competing interest that this is a country founded on the rights of private property owners. And if I buy a property, I have certain expectations around my right to be able to use that in certain ways. Now, and then that's contrasted against the sort of the foundation of zoning law and the fact that, in residential neighborhoods, we tell you can't build a pig farm, right? So there are certain things, you can't do in certain zones. And so there is always going to be this conflict about what we can tell people they can do and what they can't do with their property that they own. I personally feel, that we do need to do as much as we can to enforce and to regulate uses of property that have, the potential detrimental effects that short-term rentals have. And I think that that's very clear. Certainly for me, the biggest, problem that I think we clearly see here in Stillwater without really being able to articulate it really well through the data that we have right now is the cost of housing. But that's not just short-term rentals, right? That's long-term rentals too, right? The fact that you can buy a house in Stillwater and rent it out long-term or short-term. Short-term means that we've got a lot more investors that come in and buy property, make property less available for folks that are just wanting to live in it. And certainly short-term rentals add to that, but they're not the only thing that's causing that in our community. We need more housing in general. I guess I would have questions. My questions for Bob and Gary from the Westwood neighborhood. If we were able to add regulation and better enforce regulation to keep, if it's a short-term rental, having the occupancy limits actually enforced, are these things that you would be more okay with the idea of a short-term rental in the neighborhood, or is this something that you feel like should not be, permitted at all specifically within the neighborhood overlay? Is that a complete, and you're welcome to answer. I'm really truly interested. Is it just a regulation issue, or do you feel like it's not going to work at all? That'd be great. I'm sorry to make you get back up there, but.
Well, what I would say is simply that our problem isn't every short-term rental. We're not opposed to all short-term rentals, but when we have every neighbor affected by a short-term rental application and you disregard that, to me, that's a big problem.
Well, but Gary, in that instance, the neighbors are concerned about what the effects might be of a short-term rental, not actually what they are, because with that we can't necessarily predict that ahead of time. And I think what we saw in the numbers, and I don't know about the one on your street, but we saw the number of complaints. We saw 3 properties that have actually received complaints in 4-6 years or however long we've been doing this. And so, it's hard for us to say, just because a neighbor complains, that might actually have
it's empty. No, we don't. That's not a complaint that we can make. I'm saying you're taking a neighbor away from us when you approve that. And in fact, that's what happened. About maybe 10% of the time that this particular house was occupied last spring, maybe 10%. And I guarantee the city did not come out a net winner. They've actually made it a long-term rental again this fall. There's 3 kids who live there. That's fine. Yeah, we've got neighbors.
But we can't regulate people being in a house ever.
Well,
right? Just because, they can buy a house and not have anybody living in it. That's not something we can regulate.
Okay, that's true. But What we're talking about is, the ordinance specifically says the impact on the neighborhood. And we all were saying, look, this takes away the idea of having a neighbor, someone who lives there, whether they're a long-term rental or they're an owner or whatever. Most people don't buy a house and leave it empty. And that's, I'm not suggesting that that's going to happen.
So, I mean, you'd be more interested in seeing a regulation around short-term rentals that says if there are a certain number of objections from the neighborhood, that it will be denied.
Well, I felt like if the ordinance had been followed and the impact on the neighborhood, which we have established, at least in my opinion, established that night. I mean, we can't see the future absolutely, but actually we were right. And what we're saying is, if you have just a constant turnover of people there, which a short-term rental allows, and this is allowing a business to run in the neighborhood. And by the way, for those here who have short-term rentals, I'm not for doing away with those. I'm saying, and I'm sorry I didn't really get the time, it didn't allow me to point out, but if you live in the middle of all those red dots, you don't have neighbors. And that's you're killing a neighborhood when you allow that.
Okay. And
if you don't listen to the neighbors when they object, I don't know why we even have a hearing.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make, I guess, or the question I'm trying to ask is if we were talking about what we can do differently with these regulations, because the current regulation says we can make a decision, the legislative bodies have to make a decision about what the effect on the neighborhood may be.
Yes.
That's not necessarily something that we make just based on what 1 or 2 or 5 people say. That's got to be a decision that's made based on a broader set of data than just because there's going to be neighbors that say, I don't want this next to me.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a homeowner saying, or a property owner saying, I'm going to keep it up. It's going to be great. It's not going to have an effect on the neighborhood. And so we've got to try to make that legislative decision. It can't necessarily, under the current regulation, we can't just say, hey, they objected, so we have to say no. We have to make that legislative determination. And I understand how you feel and why you feel the way you feel. I don't disagree with you at all, Gary. I'm just saying that that's not the way the regulation is written right now. We could rewrite the regulation to make a certain number of objections actually fatal to the. But we've still got to make
even that because every situation differs.
And
on our little street, there are 5 houses. That's it. So one of those 5 houses was empty basically last spring, and because they were granted a short-term rental, and I guess they tried it. Apparently, it didn't work. But to me, at least, the ordinance as written, if followed, and say, look, we determined if the city council, and at least the impression I had, to be honest, was that city council, maybe the planning commission, were afraid the city might get sued. Well, frankly, all you have to have is a rational basis. We more than provided a rational basis for the city council to deny that application. If they were crazy enough to spend the $5,000 or $10,000 to attack it, they would have lost. Because as well as I do, rational basis test, the attacker never wins. And so, like I say, at least my way of thinking, and in that particular case, we were talking about someone from Texas. So effectively, the City Planning Commission and the City Council chose someone from Texas over the residents there. We have more than that. We've got more than that here tonight with the Westwood Neighborhood Association that is concerned about if the City Council continues to approve these dots. Those, like I said, you just put a little X on that. And we worked too hard to have the Westwood Neighborhood Association be a place that people want to live. The values of the properties have gone up fairly dramatically, really, as a prop, which doesn't do me any good. That raises my taxes, I guess. But the point is simply, at least, if nobody objects, if the neighbors, people within 300 feet don't object, then it may be reasonable to grant that short-term rental. And there may be a whole group of them in one little, cul-de-sac or something. That doesn't affect anybody, have an adverse effect on anyone. But in this case, in my opinion, it did have an adverse effect. This was a house directly across the street from me, that had kids in it before, who were nice kids. You get to know them, you take them cookies, do things. They kind of keep an eye on your house. That's what neighbors do. But a short-term rental, they're here and they're gone. And frankly, to be honest, from an enforcement standpoint, both numbers noise, everything else. All of that happens when code enforcement's off duty. There's no way that anybody's going to get any type of enforcement. There you might complain after the fact or whatever, and you don't know. I mean, like I say, numbers. I mean, you're not going to go over and say, okay, who's related here?
Yeah.
Because if there's a family of 5, that's a legitimate use.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, Gary, and I think you have that you're not asking for a complete moratorium or a complete, outlawing of all short-term rentals within the Westwood overlay. You just want to see us enforce regulations better and keep the regulations that we've got on the books.
Yeah.
I just want to. That's what I was trying to clarify.
I thought some of the suggestions that Councilor Hawkins had would be perfectly legitimate and reasonable because, again, if you crowd too many dots in an area, you're going to kill that neighborhood.
Well,
and that's something I think that the city council, cities across the country have said, it's too late. We've already lost our city because everything's a short-term rental. And that can happen to you if you're not careful because as an investment property, it can be worth more to people than it is for a young couple, start in our neighborhood, with the Westwood neighborhood, Westwood school. We have a lot of people who want to live there with their young children. And there's nothing better than driving down the street and seeing young kids playing in the yard and all that. So our neighborhood has, like I say, changed dramatically in that 15 years.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate it. No, I appreciate it. Sure. Are you answering my question?
Yeah.
Are you opposed to short-term rentals altogether in the Westwood neighborhood?
Genial thought. So, the neighborhood association is established with its rules and regulations. And as I said earlier, until we know that the council and the city wants to enforce that, it's a continual headache to try to.
But Bob, we're here talking just about the short-term rentals. I know that there are bigger problems with the Westwood overlay that need to be addressed, but from a short-term rental perspective,
it all ties in with what Gary was
It does, and so that's my question though. If you felt like the short-term rentals were being enforced the way the overlay is intended to be enforced, you'd be okay with the short-term rentals. Okay, that was the only question I had.
Yeah, and I will just point out that insofar as this is all concerned, that we had a person show up at our last meeting from an Oklahoma City address who said that of all the places in the state that they had looked to buy a home, the Westwood Neighborhood Association was the ideal place. And they are investing a lot of money to try to get into the Westwood Neighborhood Association. We think this sort of thing is good for the city and it can continue. I will just, I had one little anecdote that I wasn't able to get across the last time, but I think it also ties in to this whole process. I walked the neighborhood association with some information. I think it was 6 or 7 miles. And I came across a college student, a woman who was leaving her 4-bedroom home as was a rental person in the home. And I said, are you happy living here in this sort of environment? She said, by all means. And I said, well, how many of you are there? And she said, well, there are 3. The woman who owns a house has an extra bedroom that she could easily fill. It's close to campus, but she thinks that abiding by the standards of the neighborhood association is good for the city. And I agree. Yeah. She could easily have made more money, but she thinks that the overall benefits override all of that. So
thank you, Bob. Thank you.
Yeah.
My point here is that we have a few options, right? One is to do what we're doing, right, which is a fairly low impact. We're not spending a lot of time or money clearly on enforcing the laws or the permit we have on the books right now. We don't really have the time or the money or the personnel to do much more than we're doing, right? I mean, code enforcement staff's here. How many code enforcement staff do we have? 2. And so while I do agree that we need to be doing a better job of enforcing, I don't know that we have the resources to really up the way we're doing enforcement on short-term rentals right now. And certainly if we want to put more guidelines in place and put more regulation in place about how we handle these short-term rentals, we're absolutely going to have to increase the fee. We're going to have to put money in from somewhere else, whether that's from hotel tax, which would require an actual ordinance change because that's not written into the ordinance right now. We would have to find a way to hire more enforcement personnel because what we're talking about in terms of being able to enforce short-term rentals to the extent we would really like to see them enforced, you're talking about a full-time job for at least one person, if not more than one person, which I'm not opposed to at all. We're just going to have to figure out how to pay for it. And I think, seeing a $500,000 economic impact of what these rentals bring to the community, there is a reason for us to look at that from an economic perspective and say, is it worth it to us to make sure that we are actually getting all the money we're supposed to be getting out of these things and paying for the enforcement that we need to do that. So, I think it's from a community perspective, we have a choice here is to say, yeah, we can put a more stringent regulation in place. We can put more stringent guidelines that say, this is what you're supposed to approve and this is what you're not supposed to approve from a planning commission guideline. We can put more, what we saw on the list of other places that have those sort of books of regulation around short-term rentals. I have no objection to that generally. It will be more expensive for the people who own them. It will be more time consuming and it will require new staff and additional staff to the city to be able to do that. Alternative probably, if we want to avoid the problems, is to say we're going to limit the number. We're not going to issue any more permits. We're not going to allow any more of these things. Now, the question then becomes, well, we clearly already have 300 or 400 of them that we're not collecting, that we may, we're not enforcing the license, on now. And so if we say you can't do it anymore, how are we going to actually enforce that? I think what we need to do is look at increasing our level of regulation around this industry, and then figure out how we're going to pay to actually enforce it. Because I do agree with the folks that are here that are doing a good job. I think we do have a lot of owners of short-term rentals in this community that do a great job with them. I have one in my neighborhood that came to city council on objection that I voted to approve. And I'll tell you what, it's a well-kept house. It's right at the entrance to my neighborhood. They keep it up. It's not busy. They probably rent it out 6 times a year and they make their money off of it. And it hasn't caused any problems in my neighborhood. They do a good job with it. So I don't think that we have a huge problem of these things being run down or being eyesores or being, like the Vice Mayor said. I think we have that problem more on our long-term rentals than we have on our short-term rentals. But there is I think a need here to see what we might be able to do from a staff perspective on increasing the level of regulation, how much it's going to cost, and how we're going to pay for it. I am not in favor of adding any more burden or workload to our enforcement staff now because we have overlays on the books that we're not enforcing as well as we could be enforcing them. We've got to figure out a way to do that, but we've got to figure out a way to do that in a way that we can afford to do because we just don't have the staff or the resources to enforce a more stringent level of guideline right now. So I would like to see us figure out what that might look like and figure out, can we pay for it and do we want to pay for it?
Mayor, if I may make a couple of comments that I think would add value to this discussion. So part of the reason we're having this study session is because it's been some time since we passed this ordinance, and now as we're seeing it in practice, we're seeing some challenges and wanting to, discuss how we could improve our processes. One thing that I think that's important to point out is, as our code's currently written, although notice is sent to neighbors in the 300-foot radius, anyone can file an objection or an appeal. And actually, that is what we're seeing. I know staff can speak to that. We are receiving objections and appeals from people. And to Mr. Clark's comment, that those are people that are making comments that aren't the neighbors. And so that's one thing that we're looking at as in terms of addressing how we can improve our process is to limit, standing of those people to the notice area. That's one thing that we've been discussing as far as a possible improvement to our current code section. And then another thing that we haven't discussed tonight that I do think is important to point out is the code does provide for suspension or revocation after a license is issued. It can be suspended or revoked for any violation of any section of the code or state law. We just haven't had that occur. I don't believe so. I believe that because of what we've seen in code enforcement is that we have been able to get compliance. And so we haven't exercised that, but the code does provide for that.
Yeah, that's great. And, I think the concern I have about the code as it's written is that actually getting it in place on all of the places that are renting their homes out short-term rental is the problem, right? We can tell them you're suspended or you're revoked, but are they actually taking it off a site? Are they actually not continuing to use it as a short-term rental? And honestly, given that there's 300 or 400 or 500 of them, that our code enforcement folks could be out there literally all day long checking on these to see if they're being used as short-term rentals. And so, right now, what it seems we have is people who care about the community and who care about doing the right thing are going and getting their licenses and are paying their $100 and they're following the ordinances the way they're supposed to follow them. And that's great. And the people who don't care about that kind of stuff are not doing it. And we don't really have any way to make them do it. And so, if we suspend them or revoke their license or whatever, are we really going to keep them from doing what they're doing? So to me, that question of how do we actually, if we're going to have a regulation about short-term rentals on the books, we have to have one in place and we have to have a process in place where we can truly enforce it. And we can say, if there is a person renting their house out on a short-term rental site in Stillwater, they either have their license or they're getting a ticket for not having their license. And that's not something I think we can say now. To me, I say this about other things too. If we can't enforce something that we put on the books, we shouldn't have it on the books. And I would rather us not have anything on the books than have something that only the people who really care about compliance are actually doing, because it's not fair to them. It's not fair to the folks who are paying their fees and who are doing a good job if we're they're doing it and the people who don't care about it are just not, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So I think we need to figure out one way or the other. We got to figure out a way to actually enforce what we put on the books, and go from there.
So one quick thing you kind of alluded to a second ago. The news to me tonight was that we have 150 or so that we know about and 500 or so in the area that we don't altogether. We need to get a handle on that gap there and figure out how many we have, where they are, and go from there. That's a data point that I think I would need to try to understand this. And if we can enforce fees on some of those 350 that we don't know about, that generate some revenue to maybe help with compliance. But I know that raised concern when I heard Christy say there's 500 that she knows of, and we know of 150. There's kind of a problem there.
Will? Sure. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Mike Martin, and I live on 3rd Street, and I'm the new kid on the block. I've only been there 7 years. And I'm going to throw some quick numbers at you and where I come from. Graduated 50 years ago. My soon-to-be bride, who's still my bride, we picked out 3rd Street 50 years ago, and it took us 43 years to get back. That being said, we picked it out for several reasons. I come to you as a retired school superintendent. I hardly twitch when I get in front of board meetings. And this is where my wife would say, don't say anything stupid. So, but as an old football coach, you sometimes have to cut to the chase, and we're dancing around this, and I think it's a good meeting, and you've heard it, but I live by two things as a school superintendent: was document or die. If you don't write it down, it never happened. And we need to document. I'm speaking for the Westwood Association. We need to document those rules. And for the lady that was the realtor, do you tell the prospective buyers about our overlay? Thank you.
They have to sign a document.
I was just curious. Do all the realtors do that?
They're supposed to, but like anything else, everyone's different.
Document or die. And the other one is how do you eat an elephant? One little bite at a time. If we can put, for the realtors and the people that have the concerns, and you've hit upon it, we've all been nice, it's enforcement. But how do you eat an elephant? You document it. You make sure the realtors have a copy of that and the law and the enforcement people put it on the door, circle it, and go on. It will eventually turn the tide. It may take a long, long time. But I bought on 3rd Street for 2 reasons. One was being a superintendent. I wanted to be able to sit on my back porch and drink a beer and hear the bells of the library. And then I wanted to sit on my front porch and hear the sounds of Westwood Elementary and drink a beer. But it's a wonderful place. The work that came before we moved there is amazing. But and I'll close with this: 33 years in education, I spent all my time in small schools. And if you lose your schools, you lose your town. If you lose your schools, you lose your neighborhood. How many of you can tell me what a blue ribbon school is? Raise your hand. Oh my God. That is the highest honor an elementary school can have in the United States. 1% of 1% takes 3 years, or it did when I tried to do it. It takes 3 years to get that award. And within 300 feet of my house, there are 3 families that have 9 kids, and they live there because of that school. I'm done.
Thank you, sir.
I think one thing that I think this conversation around enforcement, I think this conversation around data is so incredibly important. But I also want to acknowledge some of the concerns that our planning commission voiced in terms of just having a better set of guidelines and regulations as they're making these determinations. I think, Gary, listening to you talk about the community character and the integrity of the neighborhood, we don't really, as governing bodies, have very good language that reinforces exactly what that means and what the kind of boundaries and pieces of that. I think that's what I heard some of our planning commission speaking to a little bit in terms of how we make decisions around whether or not a certain application or license would be harmful to the neighborhood. And so understanding that and building that into the decision making, I think would be very, or into the regulations or guidance would be very helpful. I don't know what that looks like. If it could be, a number that potentially, right, if you look at a neighborhood like Westwood, that's receiving a lot of this pressure from the short-term rentals because of their proximity to campus, maybe there is a saturation level at which that is, inherently harmful to the integrity of the neighborhood. Maybe it's something, as Gary mentioned, or as council mentioned, everyone in that block or everyone within that 300-foot radius is saying this is a concern to them. I think my concern with that is that you will have people that just don't want them, right? Whether it's necessarily harmful to the neighborhood or not. So I think balancing that out with some sort of further description, if that is maintained in the regulation, I think would be very helpful. I'd be interested from the Planning Commission, is there anything else in those, as it comes to you first, are there other things in further defining these that would be helpful as we consider the ordinance and the guidance?
Not necessarily on the topic of defining, I guess. One of the things that was brought up earlier that I think is really tough for me is whenever we hear Stillwater residents that are bringing up this issue and objecting, and we're ruling in favor of someone that's out of town coming into Stillwater and buying a property. And for us, we typically try to ask, okay, so who's going to be actually taking care of the property? And most of the time it's not someone that's employed. It's I have a friend who is going to come and clean it. I have a friend who can stop and check in. I think those issues for me are big. Having somebody that is directly responsible living in Stillwater for the property, I think is something that would be important to just be much more hands-on, I guess.
Yes, I concur with that. I think the idea that Councilman Hawkins mentioned alluded to the example of Lawrence, Kansas, where it has to be an owner occupant in the house. And I think certainly that would be most relevant to districts like the Westwood Overlay, to the neighborhood that I alluded to earlier, off of Washington Street, north of the campus. Also, I did suggest that neighborhood contact Westwood and learn how they went through the process of establishing an overlay district. But I think certainly, like you mentioned, having a requirement that person has to be an owner occupant of that house would help.
I'll just, as an aside, say I've Airbnb'd a house in Lawrence, Kansas that was definitely not owner occupied.
And I think one of the things that I would just clarify on that is that it was, and I don't know where you stayed in Lawrence, so, but it has to be owner occupied if it's in one of the residential single family districts.
It was residential single family.
So they have the same problem we do.
That was my point. I think that it's an enforcement issue more than anything else.
I think the one other thing that I mentioned that I'd like to see some consideration given to is safety around the schools. Who can rent these? Are we allowing someone who might have less than forthright intentions being near a school?
Did you just put that on the application? Do you have less than?
Sure, yeah, let's just put that on the, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would, like I said, I think it would be great if we can beef up the regulation a little bit to give a little bit more guidance. I think when it comes down to it, though, at some level, unless we're making this just a ministerial act that staff is just checking a box and saying yes or no, you get a license, even then there's going to be an appeal process, right? There's always going to be an element of discretion, and those of us that serve on these boards are going to be put in positions every once in a while where we just have to decide, I mean, if that's a concern that you have about an application, you should absolutely voice that and vote no. I mean, I think that I don't know that, that we have I've always voted my conscience on the ones that have come before me, and I will explain, and I would sit down with whoever, if you disagree with the way I voted on approving or disapproving anything, happy to sit down and explain why I did what I did. But hopefully those of you on planning commission and certainly the rest of the counselors, there is no, we have to approve any of this. This isn't the marijuana regulation. We do have to approve the marijuana ones. We have very little discretion in those, but with these, we have the discretion. And if you do have a genuine concern about the fact that this may, contribute to the detriment of a neighborhood, or that this is, I would encourage anyone to say, I don't think this one should be approved. I mean, I don't think there's any fear of us getting sued. I mean, we certainly could. I mean, there are certainly those cases where if we just approved one right next door and then we don't approve that one, they could have a case. But I mean, that's our job on these boards, is to make those decisions and try to figure out what we think is best in difficult calls. And we have to, we have to make those decisions on our own, and we have to be able to explain them. But I hope, from a planning commission perspective, that you all feel like, you have the ability to make those decisions, and, you may deny one and it comes back to the council and gets appealed and we approve it, or you may deny it and it gets appealed, you may approve it and it gets appealed and we deny it. So I think we just need to feel at some level we're going to have to make those tough calls, and we've just got to know that we can make decisions that we feel are best.
Well, I think this discussion has given us some degree of authority to make those kind of discretionary approvals. I don't know what the city attorney staff thinks about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So long as it's not applied arbitrary and capricious and you set your reasons forth in the record for your decision, you can consider all of the things that are set forth for considering specific use permits, because that's what you're directed to in making these decisions.
I think on the application, it might be helpful, and maybe, I don't have in front of me or studied it, but we asked the same questions during the planning commission meeting. We try to get an idea of the number of people allowed, the situation with vehicles, minimum number of nights. If those are all claimed by the applicant in writing, it seems like that could be beneficial from enforcement. And if they violate that, they lose their license. I mean, it's because you don't want it to be a long process where it's back and forth. That's just it. This is what you said you wanted, and we agreed to that. Because when they tell us things in front of the planning commission, we just have to sort of believe that that's how it's going to be. We have no real teeth in, if they say they're only going to allow 3 cars, I don't know. They could have 5. We're not going to know. And so there's just no mechanism, it doesn't seem like, for that discussion where we go back and forth on what's going to be allowed, for there to be any repercussions from that.
If I may expand on what I think you're trying to relay, most times when we have a public hearing on this, it's the same questions that the planning commissioners like to ask to help the people objecting. Who's our contact if there is an issue? Do you have someone in Stillwater? Who is going to regularly mow? All those things are not in the application process currently. And I would propose maybe that we look into that and capture all that ahead of time so that the applicant can think about those things and the planning commissioners can make a better decision.
Well said.
I think it would also, in terms of what gets asked and what is on the application, and maybe you all see this, but a floor plan of the house to know if someone's saying this holds 8 people and it's a 2-bedroom house, that maybe perhaps it shouldn't hold 8 people. And I don't know if that's something that's reviewed.
That is captured now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I will say, I think one of the things that was the most eye-opening to me as we've gone through this process and in different neighborhoods that have come forward, and Commissioner Shanahan mentioned it, and I alluded to it earlier, and that's what I'll refer to as the Will Rogers neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that's immediately west from Will Rogers Elementary School across Washington. The neighbors took the initiative to put together a map to show the number of owner-occupied homes, rentals, corporately owned, and short-term rentals. And for me, that was an eye-opener to see what had happened to the neighborhood. I'm going to be hopeful that that neighborhood isn't already lost, because there are so many in there already. But I think having some type of way to look at this, and so I think what's been discussed is maybe limiting a number or a percentage to be able to think about in a certain area. Now, that's not going to be easy. I agree to determine what that district or area is, but I certainly think that would be helpful for us. I think that would help us get a little bit more feel for character impact of the neighborhood. Because the ones that at least I have been in opposition to, that I voted in opposition to, it's been a character of the neighborhood feel for me. But again, it's a little subjective currently. I also think limiting the number would help us a little bit on the affordable housing that's been touched on, maybe help keep costs from skyrocketing in a certain neighborhood that might otherwise be occupied by families or someone who wants to be within walking distance of an elementary school or perhaps a university. So those are just some things I wanted to add.
This actually has to do with something that you talked about.
Can you come to the microphone, please?
This is sort of off the wall, but this goes out to Hawaii because I was born and raised there. That's why I'm a little more familiar with their market. But they actually require on public postings that your license number be posted there. So in other words, as part of the ordinance, add in that any advertisement has to actually have your license number. So then if code enforcement sees something on Airbnb with no license number, they're in violation whether they have a license or not. But that forces that, and so that's something. Again,
That's a good idea.
That's all the way out in Hawaii, but why not?
That's
What's
a good
the
idea.
downside?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. And I think actually I'd like to see our commercial properties, even the ones that are in commercial zones, just have to get a permit, just so we know that they're doing it and they would have a permit number too, and they'd have to list it so that we can keep a track of everybody. You know, those are fairly low impact kinds of additional sort of controls that we could put in place without a whole lot of extra effort right now. But I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff here tonight that we've kind of thrown around, and that's a lot of staff work that's going to have to be done to kind of see what we can potentially put in place currently under without a huge lift, and what might actually be new additional regulation that we put in place that would require really a different level of effort. From a staff standpoint, do you guys have questions about kind of what you've heard or what you think direction should be going from here?
No, I can, if you want to go to the next slide, I can kind of, yeah, we obviously, well, I'll first just say thanks for everyone again for attending this meeting, both Planning Commission, our public guests, and for sharing your comments. And of course for the council as well. You know, we have a lot of work to do. We obviously know that we got to dive in and get data, make data-driven decisions. We'll utilize our partnership with Visit Stillwater to help get some of that data and try to work and draft revisions to what we've heard tonight. Just to remind people of the public process, anytime we make a text amendment, we first review it obviously in our city departments. We have a builders relations committee that we send text amendments like this through for review and comment, and then ultimately we schedule a public hearing at Planning Commission that will have a public notice put in the paper, and then Planning Commission reviews that text amendment, makes comments, and then ultimately it goes to the City Council with their recommendation. I'm kind of speaking, Kimberly, jump in. I know that we're probably going to have so much work to do on this that we would probably bring it back to council as a discussion item again before we send any draft revisions through the Planning Commission.
Yeah, that would probably be my recommendation based on what we've been discussing this evening. Brady's outlined the process for making an actual change to the code, but it sounds like we need to present some more data points and some two things here. Improvements to the code to address the regulations, the enforcement, the application process, and then also probably a secondary piece regarding enforcement separately is kind of what I'm hearing. And if that's what Council and Planning Commission think is a good next step, then staff will work on that.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
I mean, these are slow processes. Unfortunately, this is not stuff that gets changed overnight. And I know we've got pending applications, we've got decisions that are going to have to be made in the meantime, and issues that continue to be of concern while we're trying to figure out what to do next. And I think the only thing I'd say about that is that you guys being here and sharing comments and continuing to let us know when you see issues is the best way to continue to move that process forward. I think the fact that we're all sitting in a room together right now is at least a positive indication that we're committed to working and figuring this thing out and trying to balance the interests of multiple different parties who are interested and involved in short-term rentals, and I'm excited to see what staff can bring back with some more data and some more options on what this might look like. Further comments? All right. Well, at this time, I will adjourn this meeting of the Stillwater City Council and the Stillwater Planning Commission, and I appreciate you all being here. Do we have to vote to adjourn?
I would recommend a motion, a second, and a roll call, please.
We have a motion from Councilor Clark and a second from Councilor Hawkins to adjourn the meeting. Please call the roll.
Mayor Joyce,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Jaworski, Councilor Hawkins, Councilor Clark,
Yes.
Councilor Harden,
With a vote
Chair
of five.
Phillips,
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Vice Chair Williams,
Yes.
Commissioner Shanahan,
Yes.
Commissioner Prater, Commissioner Peters.
Yes.
Motion carries with 10 yea votes.
We're adjourned.